Yes.
Bruce, we touched before lunch, using Professor Cash's evidence as one of the means of doing so, on what was known about the seriousness of viral hepatitis. And I just want to look at a handful of other materials that you've provided to the inquiry or referenced in your statement, which touch on a similar issues. So the first is at NHBT 5025_012. This is an article from 1965, I think. Yes, 1965, entitled "A New Antigen in Leukemia Sera." We can see, thank you, Chimik, the Australia antigen is found in the sera of some normal individuals from foreign populations. The total absence of the antigen from the sera of normal US subjects and its relatively high frequency in acute leukemia suggests that the presence of the antigen may be of value in the diagnosis of early acute leukemia. And then if we go to the third page, pick it up on the right-hand side. Thank you. We can see on the left-hand side of what's on the screen, second paragraph, the high incidence of the Australia antigen in the leukemia population as compared with normals or other patient populations suggests that either persons with the Australia antigen have an increased susceptibility to the development of leukemia, or to the antigen itself as a manifestation of the disease process, perhaps secondary to an alteration in some normal serum constituent with a resultant change in antigenic configuration. Or 3, the Australia antigen is related to the virus which has been suggested as the cause of leukemia. Now, whether any of those were correct or not, as I understand it, the significance you attach to this is that it shows that back in 1965, the year you were born, a possible association between hepatitis B and cancer was already under investigation.
Yes. I mean, it's further highlighted in another document I believe I gave you, which was the actual discovery of hepatitis B, the detail of the discovery of hepatitis B. In this document, they're actually mixing up two viruses here. The likelihood is that these populations were so heavily exposed to probably trial vaccines being Australian Aboriginals, and the series of crimes that were committed against those peoples, particularly pre-World War II, suggests to me there was an awful lot of trials. I mean, most of your original vaccine trials are done in concentration camps and prisons, and they're not particularly ethical before the war. What they've got mixed up here is Australian antigen and HTVL1. However, the Australian antigen was originally isolated not in blood, not in a living individual, but on autopsy in the cancer tumour, in a primary liver cancer tumour in an Australian Aboriginal. Now, I've always been curious as why every haematologist that ever tells you the story either gets the date wrong or they get the actual detail of discovery wrong. So we had 1968, no, it was 1965, first isolation. It wasn't isolated in a living human being. It was isolated on autopsy, and it wasn't isolated in their blood. It was isolated specifically in a tumour. They then went on to see if the results were replicated in other Australians, Aboriginal peoples, and found an association between the Australian antigen and the expression of liver cancer. And that would have been in by about 68, 69. And they would have known that by this point in time there was definitely a link between primary liver cancer and the Australian antigen, Hep B, by that period of time.
And then you referred a moment ago, and you referred this morning to HTLV1, and your statement also refers to HTLV2. Of course, we've had a lot of evidence in the inquiry about HTLV3. We can look at the documents if necessary. You have produced some material about HTLV1 and 2 to the inquiry. But in broad terms, what has been your thinking or the lines of inquiry that you've sought to chase down in relation to HTLV1 and 2 more recently?
Started to pick up on, when I was going back through the documents for this process, I started to pick up on a number of American follow-up studies in this thing called the American Cancer Hunters, where they put millions, hundreds of millions of dollars, post-war, 40s, 50s, into physically going out there and trying to find viruses that cause cancers. I presume with the idea of inoculating against cancer. Not a bad aim. We've got it with human papillomavirus, be very successful. But that means that by definition you become interested in populations that are expressing things, and you only do these things and spend millions because you've already got a problem. So I went back and had a look and discovered these studies of American service personnel, 1950s, children of American service personnel who all were developing T-cell leukemias, which I've now discovered were kind of unique before the war, went on the rise and kind of on the descent again. That's HTVL1. I knew that from reading the outline Discovery HTVL1 79 and some other documents over the years. So what I think we need to grasp is the idea that they already knew that they had, through the vaccines, by accident mainly, introduced a series of other antigenic substances, mainly viral, into the populace that were then being expressed in new disease within these populations. So America, UK, we had massive outbreaks of particular cancers that we just hadn't seen on those scales before. We got clusters of leukemia all the way through the 70s. I can remember the documentaries trying to claim it was the electric pylons or it was the Faslane nuclear base. But the one thing that always struck me about them all was they're all about the same age. They all would have been immunised about the same time. And because you're looking, and particularly in those leukemia clusters in Britain, what I found really intriguing about the ones that were well marked was that they were rural. So as a result, there'd be one GP's practice, which means one batch of vaccine. So you wouldn't need every batch of vaccine to be contaminated. The reason we use seed lines, for example, is to reduce genotype expression into vaccines. You have a reliable seed type that's got that virus in it that you use to make your vaccine. You make sure it's super clean, and then you replicate it. So you unfreeze a bit, replicate the virus, and produce your vaccine. And you have that reliable seed line. We have made mistakes in the past with those seed lines, and we've introduced serotypes. And as understanding increased, and what we've got to remember in the 60s, that we had some very important discoveries that allowed us to see viruses for the first time in detail. So the electron microscope has now got to the point where it's a civilian, not military tool. It's been a military tool for a long time. Portman Down undoubtedly would have had several, but it starts to get into universities. So Oxford's got one by 68. On top of that, you're measuring leukocyte derangement, which is direct indication of immune responses. And you've also got these diseases being expressed like HTVL1, which is really interesting in that all of our haemophilia consultants are also leukemia doctors. So the guys that are treating us and saying, no, these are just mild infections, they're actually dealing with a bunch of children with cancer who are dying. I remember being on the ward. A few times I was on a children's ward. It felt like those mornings you were the only kid left in the blooming unit. There were so many little coffins used to go out during the night. These patients from those same consultants, those same MRC paths or FMRC paths, they've got, by 79, a direct pathology related to a cancer in a major patient group in their practice. So why do you think it's all right to continue with haemophiliacs? It doesn't make sense to me. You've actually got a direct example in your own practice. You've got your leukemia patients, your childhood leukemia T-cell group. You know they're a virus. 79, you've got no more excuses. Discoveries made, published. You can test for it, you can find it, you can see it in an electron microscope long before you can bring a blood test. Everybody gets obsessed with blood tests. I kept hearing this all the time during the hearings. You don't need a blood test. You do to test en masse, but you don't need a blood test to see the virus. You've got an electron microscope. You can watch the little bugger swimming across the screen. You can test the immune system because each virus creates a different T-cell imprint on us. So they were already, by the end of the 70s, charting a hepatitis B T-cell imprint. So when it comes along to HIV, this is a question for the inquiry. When it comes along to HIV, when my friends are being infected with that virus, and the only reason I wasn't infected was probably because I actually didn't have a bleed for 6 years, just about. T-cell derangements before these guys ever became symptomatic would have been a fingerprint that would have been recognisable. And certainly in the documents that are published in the gay community in 81, which give us those T-cell derangements, there's no reason why haemophilia consultancy would have had books of T-cell derangements, wouldn't have gone, oh shit, we've got the CD4, CD8 thing here. So they actually probably saw AIDS before the patient was ever aware that they were sick. It's one I've tried to get through people's head for a long time. You're monitoring the leukocytes. You're seeing in real time the activity of infection. You've got specific imprints of infections, of viruses that are different depending on the... So the leukocyte response gives you a fingerprint. You've got a group of patients where you've got a leukocyte model for cancer in the blood, and you know that you're probably looking at a lymphotropic virus in relation to AIDS. And you've got this group of patients where you can go through those immune studies that we see in the Edinburgh cohort. What they were really doing was they were looking for leukocyte fingerprints. They were looking for that CD4, CD8 highlighted in problem. They had the capacity to see it before it got there, which also means that when we're looking at the slow burn ones, we had patients who were brought in for elective procedures, which is something that I just can't even fathom why you would do that in the middle of an epidemic. But the slow drip ones, so like my friends from Chalors or various other places, that means that you had one kid where you've seen this, and then you've continued to use that batch for month after month after month after month without taking account of this fingerprint that you've seen way back, sometimes 3-4 months earlier. You could have stopped it. There's points where there was enough information there to have actually prevented this, to have reduced the number of victims, to have questioned what you were doing, or even just question that batch. Have we got a bad batch? I never saw anything being withdrawn. One of the series of FOIs, please can you give me details of batches withdrawn? And until we get to HIV, until we get to the point, and I think this is really important to understand, until we get to the point where we are seen as an existential threat to the general populace, right? AIDS scared the shit out of everybody. And I'm sure that those of us that are old enough to remember, it was the talk of the pub, everybody was scared. And those of us in the haemophilia community, we can probably all remember it, we sat down and we discussed, well, if I'm positive, what am I doing next? How am I killing myself? Am I going to wait until I get really sick, or am I just going to jump off the bridge now? Well, it's a suicide plan. But these guys are watching this fingerprint. We're talking in front of the doctors. These really dark shits coming out in front of the doctors. And these guys are watching these derangements. So when it gets to the point when I'm relating to doctors, I have a real problem with them now. Because you're a scientist. Here's some data. Now you're telling me you've either ignored it, or you have noticed it, but you decided to play for what? And that's, again, one of these points I reach where, well, what is the answer to this?
I want to come back to a couple of those points later, in particular the impact upon relationships with doctors. But there's a further study that you've drawn attention to, and indeed others have drawn attention to, which is at CGRA 40672, please, Shomek. So if we look more closely, it's long-term follow-up of haemophiliacs with lymphocytopenia or thrombocytopenia, and it's from 1985. If we look at the actually, if we go to page 3, you can pick it up in the discussion. So we see the heading discussion on the left-hand side. And I'm going to pick it up at the bottom of that column. From 1975 to 1979, a cohort of 79 patients with lymphocytopenia, thrombocytopenia, or both on 2 or more occasions were identified. By 1984, 10 of the 79 patients had died. for a mortality of 3.1% per year, which was 8 times higher than the mortality in the study group as a whole during the preceding 4-year period. 5 of the 10 deaths were attributed to liver disease, and 4 of the 5 occurred in patients with persistent lymphocytopenia. Chronic liver disease was also present in 3 of the 14 adults with thrombocytopenia who were alive as of 1984. In comparison, there were no deaths and only 1 case of liver disease in the 34 children with persistent lymphocytopenia. Whether this high mortality from liver disease in adults is a function of cumulative exposure to clotting factor concentrates is not known. However, of the 10 who died, 9 were frequent users of clotting factor concentrates. And then if we go to the bottom paragraph, please. Thus, liver disease, not AIDS or AIDS-related conditions, was the most frequent cause of death during the 5-year follow-up from 1979 to 1984, in the cohort of 79 haemophiliacs identified from 1975 to 79 with persistent lymphocytopenia and thrombocytopenia. Our findings suggest a change in the natural history of haemophilia since the advent of clotting factor concentrates. As early deaths due to hemorrhage are being prevented and life expectancy is being prolonged, more late deaths in adults from liver disease are being recognised. And then reference to the hope that development of a virus-free product by heat inactivation or by recombinant will dramatically increase long-term survival for patients. And what's the significance you've attached, Bruce, to this study?
You've got to understand the immune system. We're a series of systems. The immune system is really important to understand when it comes to expressions of cancer, your ability to fight disease, your overall general health. If you add to that paradigm of an inflamed liver, where you've actually also then got biochemical elements that are stressing out your heart, your brain, etc., and you've got this derangement in leukocytes, it means that you aren't capable of dealing with something new. And this is AIDS, but this isn't HIV. Right, so my position has always been very clear, and there's a number of guys in this room will know this, is that we need to make a distinction between AIDS and HIV. We've all got AIDS. All have got buggered immune systems. They express themselves in quite unique ways, but that's because all the viruses we've been exposed to, plus the cumulative immunoresponses, plus the adaptation of the viruses, plus the reaction of the viruses into each other, will give you that different characteristic. But the fundamental underlying risk in relation to cancer and your ability to naturally prevent cancer, to deal with that replication error, is completely and utterly destroyed by having these conditions. And they should have known that back then. So my question is, 79 to 84, what were you doing with all the mild patients? Why were you still doing elective procedures? Why weren't you taking a conservative path? And why couldn't I read these side effects on my box? And why did nobody tell me? It's like, I'm fine with the idea of things going wrong. Science is part of learning from mistakes. But you're not declaring these in an open way. You're discussing them within your little club, but you're not broadening this out. You're not actually opening it up to, well, what is the implications of destroying a child's immune system? What you're actually doing here is just having a discussion about how you can get rid of it and truth cover it up and pretend that that was just a mistake from the past. Doctors like to get their house in order before they own up to something I've learned over the years. So you don't make a fuck up and own to the fuck up. What you do is you sort that, and then you kind of own up to it later. It's like we don't do that now. That was years ago. And we probably heard that as a community more than any other group of patients, right? So it's all changed, it's all better now. Yeah. Not really. All that happens is the risks are different. And yeah, I'll maybe say a bit more towards the end about what I actually mean about that.
In the BIGS document, or one of the BIGS documents we looked at this morning, you'll recall the one that talks about the virologist's reaction and the haematologist's reaction. There is a sentence to the effect that treatment for the haemophiliac is a necessity. What do you say, or what would you say to the suggestion that is articulated to some extent in the BIGS document that we've seen articulated in other material before the inquiry, that without concentrates, many of those with bleeding disorders would be dead?
Well, the first reaction is that's not entirely true, right? So let's overstated to say the extreme, because if it was true, I wouldn't have had the experience of spending time with haemophiliacs who were 70, 80-year-old as a child. How the hell did they get to be that old? How did these guys get to be 50? Yeah, they were a bit crippled. You know, they had calipers, they had built up boots from joints that hadn't grown properly, but they were alive. They certainly hadn't died of bleeds. I mean, we had this rash of so-called brain hemorrhages that we're all supposed to be vulnerable for hadn't wiped us out. There was older haemophiliacs. It was AIDS that killed most of those poor buggers. So the idea that you're talking about something that's instantly life-saving immediately, it's nonsense. It's not. It's like, sorry, you've got older haemophiliacs. How did they get old, right? How did somebody get through the 1930s with haemophilia? Because you had other treatments. They weren't as good, but they were there. So, okay, I'll buy the idea that sometimes we're going to have a haemophiliac, life-threatening bleed, losing too much blood, we're not going to be able to transfuse. Then fine. You limit the treatments to that risk, benefit, simple. But you declare the side effect and you make sure that the patient's aware of it after the fact, so they don't go home and give their wife and children hepatitis. It's the dishonesty that's written into it, the lack of collaboration with the patient, making them realise that they are part of a piece of research, that they could go home with something. We have saved your life. You were going to die. You were in a car crash. You had a huge wound. I had a massive car crash when I was in my 20s. That's all fine in an emergency situation. But the protocol wasn't that. The protocol was if you didn't get to a certain number that seemed to be arbitrary to me, and it wasn't based on observation of the patients, with cryo, then you had to give them concentrates. Even though the patient was no longer in an emergency, you couldn't pretend the patient's in an emergency. They'd been in bed for 24 hours. You could have maintained them on cryo, and those of us that are older remember being recovered on bed rest. No injections. God, during the HIV era, the one bleed I had, I just went home and ice packed and I lay down until it went away. I still have pain from it. I still have arthritis from it. Maybe that's the cripple they were trying to save me from. But if they'd taken that route, we could have limited the viral risk to those where you could truly have justified it as essential. That statement to me is an attempt to try and open up every haemophiliac up to that justification of emergency protocol, which, when I read Helsinki 2, seems to line up with the whole concept of the triaged patient, the patient where there was no alternative, which in fact is actually a thing that was put in there for warfare, really, but you can use it in civilian terms, the triage patient. So that patient, oh no, they're haemophiliac, they've got a cut leg, we'll have to give them factor. Even though 5 years earlier, cryo was what you gave them, or whole plasma was what you gave them, or bed rest. It doesn't make sense unless you're trying to justify the use of this concentrate. And that's where I get that gives me a real headache, in that the people that are doing this know that the concentrate is manky because they're studying the immunoderangement. And it brings me back to a question that I will pose towards the end of this. What were we for? What was it about? Because it doesn't seem to be about stopping clotting. That's incidental. There's far more blood tests being done to have a look at what's happening to our immune systems, what viruses we might be catching. There's little forays. I mean, I remember in the 70s, my sister getting really pissed with me because she'd been made to go into the haemophilia unit and give blood. Now, supposedly for a genetic study. My sister went looking for it, never found it. I presume I had been infected with something, and they decided to go and see if mum, dad, sister had got it. Similar to the Zuckerman 74, 75 stuff.
You've also referred the inquiry to some materials from proceedings in the Royal Society of Edinburgh in 1972.
Yeah.
I don't think we necessarily need to look at all of them, but if we just start with PRSE 302130. We can see there Royal Society of Edinburgh proceedings. We've got the date 1972. If we go over the page, we've got extracts from 3 presentations or parts of the proceedings. This is from R.A. Cumming. There's then a contribution from Professor Cash and one from John Wallace. Just want to look first of all at this. If we go to page 4, please, Shomik. Look at the bottom half of the page. We can see there the paragraph, blood transfusion seen as an applied paraclinical discipline has reached a critical point in its history. Blood and its components are now readily available and are in many situations essential for patient care in hospital and general practice and in preventative medicine. And then if we go to the next, skip over a sentence, the technical and scientific expertise used in modern blood transfusions derived from many disciplines. These are needed, such as biochemistry, immunology, genetics, haematology, microbiology. These are needed not only for the procurement and processing of blood, but also for the selection of the appropriate products for clinical use and for their quality control. And then this, along with a growing demand for greater product specificity and purity, we require more knowledge of the dangers inherent in the intensive use of potent therapeutic agents of biological origin. We need, for example, to harness the growing mass of knowledge on immunology, which already points to the presence of substances in blood capable of potentiating or blocking a variety of immunological processes and which may have profound clinical applications. Dangerous infections, not controllable by antibiotics or chemotherapy or even resulting from their use, await the procurement and processing of specific immunoglobulins, and so on. What's the reason you've drawn attention to this, Bruce?
Where do you get an immunoglobulin from? You get it from somebody that's had the infection. So what's the chances that you're taking it from an unsuitable group? Now, I became intrigued with something that kind of became legendary in haemophilia, because every time one of us heard this story from other haemophiliacs, we thought, what the hell's this about? So Robert Mackey and a couple of other people told me that they used to donate blood in the 70s. And the only thing I could think about that you would want a haemophiliac's blood for is immunoglobulins, because you've given us viruses. So we would be a good source for the immunoresponse to those viruses. Now, immunoglobulins, people, the way they've been talked about in the past is, imagine that you would go into a hospital and one person would get an immunoglobulin. The army were using immunoglobulins en masse. The American army was actually part of their standard immunizations for nearly 15 years, was an immunoglobulin. So if you've got this product that by its definition has to come from somebody who has had a serious infection and is therefore by definition more likely to be in an unsuitable donor category, your ability to exclude other negative side effects from it are significantly limited and statistically unlikely once you get into these particular diseases. So like hepatitis B, by the time you're evolving through the 70s, is probably more likely to be associated with the greatest respect to my gay friends, gay sex and drug use, right? So we're saying that certain sexual practices are unsafe. We are, at the same point, we're using immunoglobulins that come from those populations or come from us, and then we really are unsafe. Haemophiliacs, well, we've had the sum total of the viral history of man injected into our veins from children. No greater way than bypassing the immune system, large chunks of the immune system, stick it in your vein, 90 seconds later, it's been right round. It can purchase itself anywhere. So if they were taking immunoglobulins from us, which I strongly suspect they were, one of the questions I have in relation to Edinburgh, because there's an odd timing Sir Brian picked up on in relation to HIV expressions in the drug community and HIV occurring in the Royal, where the Royal seems to have gone before the major explosion in the drug community. My culprit, I think, is responsible, is immunoglobulins harvested from haemophiliacs and used on those populations as treatments, then amplified through either IV drug use or through sexual practices.
And then if we go to PRSE 302637, we can see Professor Cash's contribution to the same 1972 proceedings.
Yeah.
So if we go to the 5th page, please, Shomik. We see there the heading Safe Blood Transfusion. Although the medical profession has long recognised the concept that there are no therapeutic roses without thorns, there is no doubt that the dangers of blood transfusion in all its forms have yet to be fully defined. However, in the ardour of therapeutic endeavour, we are frequently guilty of forgetting those hazards which have already been well documented. Moreover, compared to 20 years ago, new types of patients, such as those on chronic renal analysis and marrow ablation for leukemia, are being exposed repeatedly to the hazards of blood transfusion. And then if we look at the next paragraph, picking it up, third line, almost 50% of the post-transfusion deaths were due to hepatitis. And then, while not intending to underemphasise the importance of, and then a range of factors identified, if we skip down 4 lines, the magnitude of the hepatitis problem and the recent explosion of highly productive research in this area is so great that it seems appropriate on this occasion to consider this particular feature of safety in some detail. And there is then a discussion about Australia antigen in the next paragraph. And then if we go to the bottom paragraph, we see there reference to, again, an explosive research effort in which clinicians, biochemists, geneticists, microbiologists, and immunohematologists have all made important contributions. Again, this is another source of material you've drawn particular attention to, Bruce. Can you assist us with what you've derived from this?
Well, I mean, let's start off with the idea that the Hep B test right through the 70s only was 25% effective. And we're talking about pools here. So inevitably, we have Hep B in the plasma pools. It's in the general populace, you recognise it. It's got to be in the haemophilia blood products. Statistically, once your plasma threshold reached, it becomes an inevitable outcome. You're compounding that further to what we know from the mid-70s about where you're taking the blood from. Army bases, presence. And I don't know if you're going to ask me about this later, but we had this very profound discovery that you're sticking a label on blood, right? This is high-risk blood, this is low-risk blood. So one of the things that I noticed very early on when we got the medicines inspector reports from PFC was this comment about low-quality plasma, and I felt it was a very coded term within the report. So I had to ask, well, what the hell was low-quality plasma? And it dawned on me while I was looking through it that what we're actually talking about is these bags that are marked high risk. So I would give you an example of what I think the human nature of this is. So I'm allowed to send my old unused plasma to PFC to have it fractioned. And I'm told it's going to be clean and I'm never going to have to worry about it. And I'm sitting in my blood transfusion unit at Christmas where they keep telling us they had more prison blood because they had to cover for for public holidays. Fine, okay. Don't buy it, but all right. But we're not having as much surgery over Christmas. Our emergency rate might be high, but it's not that high. We're not using huge amounts of blood. So what do you do with that blood at the end of it? If I'm sitting in a unit, even in the middle of summer, and I've got 10 units of O neg, and 4 of them have got high risk on them, they're the last bags I'm using because I've got to fill in that bloody hepatitis book and do a couple of reports. I don't want to do that. So I'd send that to the PFC. So I reckon by the time those pallets of plasma are getting to the PFC, they're nearly all universally high risk. Because human nature being such that, well, I'm not wanting to fill out a ton of paperwork. I don't have to give a patient that blood. I can give them this stuff that's low risk, less likely to have to fill in a hepatitis report, which they did do for all the whole bloods, and they did under the legislation. So what do? You've been told by the Scottish Blood Transfusion Service, you've been told by BPL, we can clean up, give us all your old stuff. So I reckon what happened is that we took all that really bad plasma and we concentrated it back into the PFC, back into BPL, and made it into blood products for us.
And you've alluded in your witness statement to a memo which you recall, I think Alice Mackey showing you.
Yes.
You haven't been able to lay your hands on it again.
No, I wish I could, sorry. Yeah.
Around 1975, PFC to blood transfusion centres, send unused units of blood, and we'll clean it up.
Yes.
That's what you're referring
It was the specific phrase, we'll clean it up, which would lead somebody to believe that, well, I know that's dirty, but they say they'll clean it up. Maybe that's what they're doing, so I'll send it on. I'll be useful, but then I'm not going to give away my best plasma because I'm not going to want to have problems in my own unit.
The third contribution to the Royal Society proceedings from John Wallace is at PRSC 304564. And we can see at the top, new approaches to the supply of blood and plasma, John Wallace, Regional Director, Glasgow and West of Scotland Blood Transfusion Service. If we go to page 4, we can see the heading plasma volume expanders.
Yeah.
And there's a reference about 5 lines down to, in countries which have a modern transfusion service, the plasma volume expander of choice is surely plasma protein fraction, PPF, which has several advantages over dried whole plasma, and those are then described. And then it says, above all, plasma protein solution can withstand heating at 60% for 10 hours. The pasteurised product is free from the risk of transmitting viral diseases, thus eliminating the hazard of hepatitis. Now, one of the themes I think you've identified from your research is various references to heat treatment pasteurisation much earlier than the
Louis Pasteur's original work was pasteurisation of albumin that was trying to make vaccines safe. Now, 60 degrees for 10 hours. The Clarkston incident, which I did read about, major explosion, lots of casualties, not a single hepatitis case, massive blood use, not a single hepatitis case. We've got 60 degrees, 10 hours. If they treated hepatitis as seriously as they did for that product in us, none of my friends would have got HIV. There'd be over 1,000 of us still here, at least. It's like the bit I've always said that. I was treated in '68, right? So if you'd only killed me, if you'd only buggered up my life, and it restricted the treatment to emergencies, then I wouldn't have a problem with this. But you could heat treat, and much earlier, you had the right temperatures. You knew how to exclude hepatitis. You even had an actual in-life emergency example where hundreds of transfusions had taken place. Massive disaster in America. Clarkston, major explosion, not a single hepatitis case. So noteworthy, it was reported in several journals. And you've got those temperatures, those famous temperatures that come back at us when AIDS suddenly makes us an existential threat to the whole of society, and people start giving a shit about the risks that they're putting us under. Those same temperatures come back, 60 degrees, 10 hours. They always knew how to exclude it. They always could exclude it.
Well, no doubt here evidence in relation to this, or examine evidence in relation to this in due course in later inquiry hearings, but have you in your researches gained any understanding of why heat treatment in relation to concentrates for the purposes of viral inactivation was not pursued and implemented earlier than it was?
Well, I've heard the one about yield countless times, but yield loss was 7%. Yield loss at 7% comparative to making a much safer medicine doesn't make sense. You're not reporting things to the Medicines Agency. We had the 1968 Medicines Act. By 1974, you're supposed to report all adverse incidents to get your proper registration, your license for your drug. But we haven't got any hepatitis reported. Nobody's talked about that. This is 1970. Right through that period, between 68 and 74, when we're supposed to be dealing with, let's not have another insidious event like thalidomide, we've actually got the way of stopping an insidious event and the continuation of this insidious event, which is haemophilia. And we're not reporting it under the legislation that was supposed to be designed to prevent those kind of insidious events from occurring. That's where I get my problem with it.
You touched this morning on the possibility of your own involvement in research. And I just wanted to ask you about one of the documents you've exhibited to your statement. It's WITM 223510. And if we go to the next page, it's published in the British Journal of Haematology in 1981, the use of factor IX concentrates in man and 9-year experience of Scottish concentrates in the southeast of Scotland. And if we go to, well, we can see, actually, if we just look at the first paragraph under the summary, again, as I think you've referred to, human factor IX concentrates have been available for clinical use for more than 20 years, originally produced for the management of haemophilia B patients. And then if we go to it's page, sorry, Shimik. '14, I hope. If we look at the top half of the page, and we can pick it up 5 lines down. In addition, other side effects of factor IX concentrate therapy must be considered. Apart from the perennial problem of hepatitis B, recent findings on the transmission of non-A, non-B hepatitis by factor IX concentrates, Wickendall et al. 1979, make it probable that many of the patients with milder disorders presented above would now be treated more conservatively, either not at all or with fresh frozen plasma, at least until further data is available on individual concentrates. Now, this was a study involving, I think, 24 or so haemophilia B patients.
Yes.
What's the basis for your view that you may have been an unknown?
Well, there's just the statistical probability that, I entered treatment 68. Factor IX haemophilia is extremely rare. There's not many children with it that are going to be born in 65 would have factor IX haemophilia, let alone be at Edinburgh Royal Infirmary through that given time, which I was for most of it, or even in Inverness, there was the data flying backwards and forwards, and all there was. The other thing that strikes me about this is this means that while I'm going to my doctor in 1980, I had pneumonia. In 1980, I was going to my doctor complaining about being unwell from about 15, complaining of profound hepatitis symptoms, trouble. I went from top of the class to bottom of the class, couldn't concentrate, couldn't think straight. I was having mental health problems, major depression. I was ill. I was going yellow from time to time. If I drank with my mates, I'm a Highland lad, used to take tins up the woods, I'd end up with yellow eyes the next day. In fact, to the point where it's like I just didn't drink for large periods of time. So this is 1979. You now know that you should be conservative, right? You definitely. You're the guy in charge of blood transfusion. You know you should be conservative. So why have I got freshly infected factor IX patients as late as 83 and 84? Why have I got friends in their 30s still who were exposed to this? Why wasn't they given the conservative route? We've got one haemophiliac that I won't name who's got a version of the condition that would have responded very well to plasma. But as I said, there was very few of us. You have to prove that your treatment works, and you need fresh meat because you've already given viruses to the others. By the way, the previous document on this, we missed out a group of patients that probably should be in this inquiry. Neonates. Factor IX was used as part of a neonatal anticoagulation. So there should be people about our age who were prematurely born out there who need tracking now for hepatitis C, who probably haven't even realised they were given a blood product because they were premature babies. A whole group of patients that I've never come across anybody that says, no, I was given a blood product as a baby. I'm a neonate. But there's this document here that says we're using on neonates. So where are they? Did they all die? Are they alive? Have nobody bothered finding them? So factor IX also, they've got 1979. That's the year before Ludlam arrives in Edinburgh. In Edinburgh, all the factor VIIIs are mainly on cryo till Ludlam arrives. This is the head of the Scottish Blood Transfusion Service. Does he not turn around to Ludlam and go, actually, it's a really bad idea, Christopher, to give all your factor VIIIs factor VIII. Can we keep the hepatitis rate down? We already know. the same paradigm exists whether you've got factor 8 or factor 9. So in 79, we could have drawn a line. Or we could have maybe at least tried to do the heat treatment experiments that had already successfully been done in plasma expanders back in the 60s and seen if we could exclude this damn virus before we carried on. But nobody seems to have wanted to shut the door. Nobody seems to have wanted to close it. And this is the bit that I always find odd. And if we'd closed that door in 79, I know for a fact there would be round about 200 more of us in Scotland alive today than there is now. And that's really upsets me, because I look at this data and I think, if you acted on it, this is good science, if you'd acted on it, if you had brought in a conservative model, tried to do something about viral eradication, we could have had, not only had a product to save lives, we could have a global leading product. Because ultimately, a large chunk of this is about making money, or saving money, or turning money into something else. Immunoglobulins is worth a fortune. Immunologically rich blood, research-wise, is worth a fortune. You couldn't have a Hep B test through the 70s without having a regular supply of Hep B. You needed virus to make the test. Where are you getting it from? Well, if you can bring it from within the NHS system, you're not having to pay a drug company for it. Cash, in particular, was obsessed with the idea of, well, I mean, he was the kind of guy, I reckon, probably when the poor man passed on a few months back, he's probably got a collection of folded bits of brown paper like my grandmother had in string, tied up every parcel. He always struck me as somebody that had to stretch it, had to push, but he's got good science here saying he shouldn't. But we've got a rash of mild haemophiliacs and a rash of haemophiliacs in Edinburgh had all been well maintained on cryo. In 1980, are suddenly being moved on to concentrates. The only thing I can conclude is that was research. Again, so we've got a group of patients, particularly in Edinburgh, uniquely in Edinburgh as adults, thanks to Dr. Davis, who haven't got hepatitis en masse. Some of them will, but not all of them. So that's as near as a bunch of virgin adults as you're going to get in the haemophilia population. So you're going to be able to come north and suddenly expose them to concentrates and record those T-cell derangements, those leukocyte derangements from the start. It was, that man arrived there ready to do research.
You've identified in the written evidence you've given to the inquiry and the oral evidence you've given so far today, your view that the risks were well known and understood within
yes.
at least the medical community, the scientific community, and your view that haemophiliacs, those with bleeding disorders, were seen as, in your phrase, useful material, subjects for research.
Yep.
Canary down the proverbial mine, to use the Dr. Giangrandi phrase.
Yep.
What if that's what happened? Why do you think it happened? What has your research led you to conclude, if anything, about what the benefits would have been to anybody of that?
Well, I mean, the first one and most obvious one is military. Right, every army has to be fit to fight. I mean, anybody that knows anything about the First World War is it actually took us nearly 2 years to get some people, because they were so malnourished and fit to fight in the war. We did a slightly better job of it in the Second World War, and we introduced vaccines which helped reduce the amount of barracks-based illnesses, but we spread viruses through those. They were aware of that, they followed that up, 50s, 60s. You had to start quantifying this. You had to start making vaccines. And here's what really messes my head up, because the one thing that stands out to me about the three viruses that we look most at in haemophilia, the Hep B, the Hep C, the HIV, there is no animal models for those. So you can't infect, that's what one of the doctors said, you can't infect a chimp with HIV. The chimp just gets better. It's not going to produce a kidney full of virus that you can then liquidize, the cheaper than chimps thing, because we was already annoyed because they'd killed a whole of these chimps without any success. We were the chimps. There wasn't a non-human alternative to reproducing three of the most significant viruses in relation to military fighting strength, Hep A, Hep B, Hep C, HIV. We couldn't deal with them. We knew they were there. We'd seen their fingerprints, leukemia, HDV-L1, etc. We knew they were linked to vaccines. They had to do something. So we become the sacrificial lambs. We become the victims of the greater good. I can understand why you would do it. It is a crime, I think. I think it's genocide, maybe. I'll leave it to better minds than mine. But it seems to me that the use of the Helsinki triage point, this is life-saving, every haemophiliac's going to die if we don't give them this, which we know is nonsense because there's guys that are older than that. It was all designed to produce enough virus so we could make those vaccines, save those soldiers, save the populations. We were used. I've always said, what were haemophiliacs for? We cost tens of thousands a year to keep. I know in this country, we allowed people to die for less money. So somebody had to be making money on the back of us. And people forget the value of a unique antigen. It's extremely valuable. Like new drugs, all that. Owning the licenses for heat treatment. Why did Scotland take a year longer to heat treat? Because they knew full well if they could come up with their own bespoke Scottish version, it was worth money. They could license it. They could make an income. It would help serve a department. So again, with the greatest respect to Professor Cash, it was kind of that brown paper and string thing again. It was like, well, yeah, we're going to make them really sick, but we can help the whole service. So it's a great good. But we're screwed in that paradigm. Okay, I mean, I'd heard one consultant very grumpily turn around to me and said, but we can vaccinate you for Hep B now. Yeah, but that actually doesn't make any difference. I've already had Hep B. My cancer risk's already jumped because of that, and even though I've cleared the virus, combined with alcohol, my cancer profile now is 20% higher than it was before you gave me Hep B. So the only purpose I can see that you had in dealing with us in that way of focusing on concentrates was the economic benefit and the military benefit you would gain from the knowledge that you drained from us. And also the canary in the coal mine bit. Yeah, they were scared the Russians were going to spike our blood. They were scared that other countries would decide to deplete us through insidious disease, as Simon Wiesenthal very grumpily said to me. When I said, well, was it the Nazis? He says, stupid boy, why do you think it was them? It was all of us. He got very annoyed. I mean, the most Jewish way possible. It was wonderful. But it suddenly dawned on me that, yeah, there is only one purpose for us. Right? So we were an issue of national security. The canaries. You had to have canaries. And then when the canaries get sick, you can take their bloods. When they die, you can chop them up and you can make tissue cultures. And I'll, to this day, swear that, and I'll be very surprised if this inquiry can't find it, that some of my friends who died of HIV had tissue removed to make cultures to grow HIV. Some of those little boys, some of those men who died, some of those women who died, became nothing more than culture subjects. And this is what I mean by who made money off us, what did they do with us? Right? To make a culture of HIV, you needed a human source. You needed a human kidney. So what were we for? Useful material is, I think, a profound understatement that describes it to its best.
Can I come then to something you said a few minutes ago? You referred to the Medicines Inspectorate report in relation to PFC.
Yeah.
And perhaps we could just look at that. BNOR 40572. There's two companion documents we should look at. So this it's a rather faint copy, but we can see it's a report on the current status at the Protein Fractionation Centre, Edinburgh, as of October the 1st, 1981. If we go to page 7, please, Shomek. About halfway down the page, we have the underlined section. We can see there, paragraph 4.3, the present buildings and facilities continue to fail to reach minimum standards of GMP, and a licence would not be recommended for an industrial equivalent unless agreed upgradings were instituted as a matter of urgency. And 4.4, the use of a closed system for plasma stripping, pooling and crushing would substantially upgrade this part of the operation and lead to clearer starting material for extraction of coagulation factors and fractionation products. So that's the Medicines Inspectorate report. Before I ask you for your observations, if we could go to BNOR 40573. We can see this is the following year, so this is 1982. It reports a visit by inspectors March 1982 and May 1982. And if we look at, on this page, paragraph 5, again, the phrases that you've drawn attention to, this proved to be a difficult centre to inspect. This was caught partly by the considerable changes in progress. There is no doubt that the existing facilities for the processing and handling of blood are grossly deficient and would have been quite unacceptable. And then reference to a need for further inspection because refurbishment was underway. And the next paragraph, the manufacturing licence for this centre expired on the 30th of June 1981. No application has been made for renewal. Those, I think, are the principal passages. There's more detail.
There's a housekeeping comment below which actually belies the overall risk within the department.
So paragraph 9.
Yeah.
Elsewhere, it was noted that an objective attitude to the preparation of standing operating procedures was apparent, and housekeeping showed signs of improvement, though this is difficult under the existing overcrowded conditions. And then there's a further discussion on a number of matters that are of interest.
There's talk of rubbish in doorways and of rodent activity. Now, the reason I highlight the housekeeping, because I think it's important to understand the whole of this document. And again, coming back to my use of the Scots word manky. Staff are coming through an entranceway that is full of rubbish. It's in the report, and it's got rodent activity in it, which means that their shoes, their clothes, etc., are being contaminated with hantavirus, various other rodent viruses, and fungal spores and bacteria, right? We know that there isn't sealed rooms for the bits where the blood's open and when the powder's being put in. These are corridors. One of them's got the cloakroom at the end of it. It's supposed to be the clean room. So those people that walk past the hantavirus sources, the dirt and the rubbish lying at the door, are now walking through the clean room with stuff shedding from their coats all the way through. Now, this is 1970s. You know, these guys should know this shit, right? You shouldn't be going into that space with any street clothes. I mean, God, as nurses, we were told in the 80s, you don't go out with your uniform on because you don't know what you're taking out into the community. You need to pack it up and get it washed. So we've got guys walking in, and I mean, this makes me wonder about what some of my friends with HIV and some of my friends with poor immune systems actually died of. By definition, just through working on basic models, you can pretty much assure that the following things would have been present in the air, in the clean rooms when they were making our products. Fungal spores. Now, I know about the fungal spores because I actually had a batch of Factor 9, albeit imported Factor 9, withdrawn, and I was told that I had injected myself with black mold. Made me sick as a dog for about 3 months. If you had HIV, it probably killed you. You've got hantavirus, which expresses itself as pneumonia, directly on people's clothes as they're walking past the clean room. So even if the whole process was clean, you've buggered it the moment you walk into the clean room, which has got the cloakroom on the other side. So you've got a building that's totally and utterly inadequate. And then when you actually go to the storage of blood, blood's being stored in redundant freezer vans that aren't even switched on. Blood's been stored at for 48 hours at room temperature, which means it was biologically active. Right? The reason for freezing things is it stops biological activity. That's why we put stuff in the freezer. It doesn't go off. The moment you leave it for 48 hours, you're going to have denatured proteins, you're going to have more viral activity, you're going to have increased bacteria activity, and fungal spores will replicate because blood's a lovely rich source. It's what we use to culture most things. It's what's in your agar plates. So you know all of this stuff. You're aware of all this stuff. You must know that to pass the flipping exams to be able to get this job, but you're still doing this stuff. And you're working in a building that has been deemed to unfit, so unfit that they haven't got a license for it. So how are you producing a medicine? This is a question again for the inquiry, because I don't really understand how you can legally do this. How are you producing a medicine in a factory in Britain by the government that if it was a private company it wouldn't be legal? How is that licensed? How is it okay to give it to me in prescription without a named prescription? Because surely the only way around that legally is named patient prescription for each drug, because it hasn't licensed. You're producing in a factory that's unfit and isn't licensed, and your solution is to introduce Crown immunity, what, a protection for government against soldiers suing them for damages in warfare. This is not even Fred Carney's army here. This is negligence on a structurally profound level. But then I actually quite feel sorry for the PFC guys, because their factory was actually designed in 1965. Because of government funding, they didn't build it to 75, which means it was 10 years out of date before it was ever commissioned. And nobody had bothered to try and update it, bring it up to stream, make it big enough, make sure they had enough refrigeration that they didn't have to stick vans in Leith whiskey warehouses at the mercy of rats. They could have built a proper building. All these things about, like, we needed extra money by 75. No, what you needed to do is you needed to not build a building that was designed for 1965 and 1975. You needed to build an up-to-date building. You wasted public money building something that you must have known from the beginning would be inadequate. How can you have a clean room that people walking with street clothes are going straight through? It's not a clean room by definition. You haven't got proper HEPA filtration. Well, HEPA filtration is what stops you from sucking fungal spores and pollens and all the rest of it into those clean rooms. So you've got guys with immune derangements, you've got HIV, but you've also got broader immune derangements, and then you're injecting them with, what, funguses? Pollen? All kinds of antigenic substances that, again, are going to antagonize our immune systems, make us more vulnerable, make us ill, cause those derangements, they say. But they were inevitable under those conditions. That's like being surprised you get food poisoning out of flipping butchers with rats running around the floor. It's the human equivalent. And they're saying it's unfit to be licensed. But this is supposed to be the gold standard, this wonderful Scottish plasma, this great factory. It was all myth, wrapped in a flag.
So I note the time. I've still got some further questions for Bruce, so perhaps we could take a break now.
Yes, certainly. We'll take a break then till 3:45.
Thank you.
3:45.